Nazis were socialists. Just thought I'd flop that one right on your chin off the bat to frighten off all the ideologues. The party that became the Nazis existed even before the establishment of fascism, though in a greatly altered, infinitely more communistic form, as
Wrong. Hold up. The DAP, or the German Workers' Party, was not a communistic party. I don't know where the fuck he got that from. It was a third positionist, anti-capitalist, anti-communist party. So no.
early as 1920 or so, but the authoritarian colossus we know from the 40s and 30s became what it was in direct response to the ascent of Italian fascism under Prime Minister and eventual dictator Benito Mussolini, from whom I will now quote: "State intervention in economic production arises when private initiative is lacking or insufficient, or when the political interests of the state are involved. This intervention may take the form of control, assistance, or direct management."
This is not socialism. This has nothing to do with socialism. Socialism is the collective ownership of the means of production by those who work in the industries. State intervention in economic production and like state seizure of industry can actually happen in like every economic system, including capitalism. So no.
This is from Fascism, Doctrines and Institutions, published in 1932, pages 135 to 136, in case you were fucking curious. Outright seizing the means of production is the bedrock of socialism.
Yes, seizing the means of production for worker control, not seizing a few industries here and there because they might be lacking in production.
Marxism, even. Incidentally, the book I've just quoted, essentially the Bible of fascism, was largely ghostwritten by Giovanni Gentile.
Hey, you want to know what the doctrine of fascism says about Marxism? Let's look at that. See, I have it right here, the doctrine of fascism. Well, if we look at this section titled The Rejection of Marxism, maybe we'll find out what they believe. Such a conception of life makes fascism the resolute negation of the doctrine underlying so-called scientific and Marxian socialism, the doctrine of historic materialism which would explain the history of mankind in terms of the class struggle and by changes in the processes and instruments of production to the exclusion of all else, that the vicissitudes of economic life, discoveries of raw materials, new technical processes, and scientific inventions have their importance no one denies, but that they suffice to explain human history to the exclusion of other factors is absurd. Fascism believes now and always in sanctity and heroism, that is to say, in acts in which no economic motive, remote or immediate, is at work. Having denied historic materialism, which sees in men mere puppets on the surface of history, appearing and disappearing on the crest of the waves, while in the depths the real directing forces move and work. Fascism also denies the immutable and irreparable character of the class struggle, which is the natural outcome of this economic conception of history. Above all, it denies that the class struggle is the preponderating agent in social transformations.
The scarcely acknowledged individual who actually conceived the concept of fascism in the first place. Gentile was a philosopher and at one point an outright Marxist. He was murdered 2 years before even Mussolini was by partisans. The mistaken presumption that fascism is corporatism, so often espoused and re-espoused by so-called democratic socialists to demarcate themselves from the Nazi and fascist ideology their movement inevitably inspired, is based on a quote attributed to Mussolini in the Encyclopedia Italiana, and for the reasons I've just mentioned has seen heavy traffic in leftist circles. It's even popped up in supposed history programs on TV and YouTube. You know who you fucking are.
He abandons his anti-capitalism to instead embrace private entrepreneurship with an element of syndicalism thrown in to give workers more influence without eliminating the traditional employer-employee relationship in a corporatist structure.
This is bullshit.
That quote is as follows. Fascism should more properly be called corporatism because it is the merger of state and corporate power. The problem? The quote is apocryphal, outright fiction. It not only never appears in the encyclopedia.
So I just want to mention, that is actually what fascism is. The economics of fascism are indeed the merger of state and corporate power. Regardless of whether or not this quote came from Mussolini, doesn't matter. Absolutely, it doesn't fucking matter. I'm sorry, Razor Fist. I don't know if you know this, but fascist regimes throughout history have had a tendency to align themselves with the very large private industries of their nations. This happened in Italy, this happened in Germany, this happened in Spain, it happened in Japan, it happened in the federal state of Austria. This happened everywhere that fascism was implemented. So, we're going to move on.
Encyclopedia Italiana, but the statement is outright contradicted by several within the doctrine of fascism, like the one about seizing the means of production that I just quoted. But we're not here to talk about fascists in Italy or otherwise, or how fellow travelers have set about erasing the socialistic origins of Mussolini.
The outbreak of a socialist revolution in one country will cause the others to imitate it, or so to strengthen the proletariat as to prevent its national bourgeoisie from attempting any armed intervention. So, this quote to me is automatically meaningless, and the reason I say this is because I don't know the context of this. So for anyone who knows anything about Mussolini and his history, you know that at one point in his life he was indeed a socialist. So is it possible that this quote came from that point in life? Or is he talking about the threat of the spread of socialism? You see, I'd like to understand the context of this quote. But of course, Razorfist isn't going to get it because he's a disingenuous hack.
Rise. We have noxious gender studies majors with more hair colors than personality traits for that. So let's rap about Nazis, shall we?
Sure.
Literally, Hitler's Germany, like Mussolini's Italy, reserved the right to seize the means of production should it become unproductive.
Which is not socialism.
Hence, the government shall intervene when incentive is lacking, quote I reference from fascism doctrines and institutions. Both Italy and Germany retained this policy, though the cooperation of private industry under threat of seizure and violence meant they were rarely forced to actually employ it. But make no mistake, the threat was real. In fact, the 25-point economic plan of the Nazi Party included the following, quote, the nationalization of all trusts, profit sharing in large industries, and an agrarian reform in accordance with our national requirements, and the enactment of a law to expropriate owners without compensation of any land needed for the common purpose, the abolition of ground rents, and the prohibition of all speculation in land. A particularly alarming one was also, quote, we demand the immediate communalization of large stores which will be rented cheaply to small tradespeople, a law that would...
So I'm going to cut him off here. You know, what's interesting about the 25-point program is that those things that he just listed were literally nothing more than lip service. When the Nazis rose to power, none of those things were actually implemented. Now, why is that? Well, do you really honestly think that the Nazi Party would have implemented profit sharing in large industries? Fuck no. That would have scared off the capitalists who are allied with the party.
Wouldn't look a bit out of place at a Seattle City Council meeting. Socialist policies all, which wasn't surprising. Gottfried Feder, who first drafted them, was an adamant anti-capitalist. He was later made the economic planner under Hitler and the Nazis.
Okay, so just because somebody is an anti-capitalist, that doesn't make them a socialist, or even a leftist for that matter. You can be, indeed, on the right and be an anti-capitalist. Monarchists, for example, are anti-capitalist. They want to replace capitalism with feudalism, or another third positionist economic system. And they are very much not leftists. So, let's continue.
As was Ferdinand Zimmermann, aka Ferdinand Fried. Reading Fried's writings in Die Tat illuminates the socialistic underpinnings of National Socialism whole cloth. He also wrote a book entitled Das Ende des Kapitalismus, a title I'm sure I don't need to translate. In 1932, Hitler asserted his first act would be an expressly socialist job creation program.
Which is not socialist. Government programs are not socialist. They can exist within capitalist economies.
Once appointed chancellor, he admittedly shifted to rearmament, but it should be noted that he repeatedly stated this was effectively a job creation program anyway. Socialists often lapse into warmongering to fund their flagging job programs. Just ask Woodrow Wilson.
So he just called Woodrow Wilson here a socialist, which I have, no response to other than... Omega lol, that's fucking stupid. Holy shit. Everything is socialism to this person. From what I can tell, to Razor Fist here, socialism is when the government does stuff. So I don't know. I feel like I'm gonna get to a point in this video where I'm just gonna not even try.
We'll explain why that is in a moment. Tellingly, Maynard Keynes, father of Keynesian economics and philosophical force behind most contemporary regulated economies, praised Hitler's policies in the preface to the German edition of his book, The General Theory, which was released during Nazi rule. Quote, "Nevertheless, the theory of output as a whole, which is what the following book purports to provide, is more easily adapted to the conditions of a totalitarian state than is the theory of the production and distribution of a given output under conditions of free competition and a large measure of laissez-faire," unquote. Socialism is not only married to Nazism.
Nothing about that quote said socialism, you dishonest piece of shit.
It thrives under it. But only, of course, if you consider the father of modern socialist economics to be in any way an authority on the fucking subject.
Keynes is 100% a capitalist, and Keynesian economics are 100% capitalist. It's like Razor Fist thinks that the only form of capitalism is laissez-faire capitalism. Holy shit. As I said, everything to this person that isn't 100% anarcho-capitalism is socialism to this guy. Holy shit.
Clinging to technicalities while skirting the meat of the matter is the surest sign of a facile fucking argument, and those who purport the Third Reich's economy was capitalist go one further still, ignoring the threat of seizure by government, and ignoring that even what little private ownership they had...
Whoa. What little private ownership they had? Okay, that's another fucking lie. The majority of the Nazi economy was in private hands. What are you talking about?
Was in fact largely ceremonial.
It's finally over. Oh, yes. Thank God. Thank you. That was awful. Oh my god, those last 10 minutes were awful. Now, granted, the entire video is dog shit, but those last 10 minutes, oh my god. I think I'm gonna have to cut those out. He was literally just rambling on about, price controls and Sweden and military police states. It was a shit show. Hey, do you guys want to learn about some, real Nazi ideology? Let's do that. So first of all, we have a list of companies involved in the Holocaust. This list includes corporations that were in existence during World War II and that are documented to have profited from the participation in the Holocaust. For anyone who wants to look at this, I will leave this in the description. Next, we have Today in Labor History, Nazis Destroy Unions. On May 2nd, 1933, Adolf Hitler's stormtroopers occupied all trade union headquarters across Germany, and union leaders were arrested and put in prison or concentration camps. Many were beaten and tortured. All of the union's funds, in other words, the workers' money, were confiscated. Former union officials were put on blacklists, preventing them from finding work. This was one of the first acts of Hitler and the Nazis, who had just come to power in Germany a few months earlier in January 1933. The German labor movement was one of the largest and strongest in the world, with some 7 million members at the time. The Nazis, much like some far rightists in our own country then and now, saw that unions exercised significant power by representing workers' interests and promoting a democratic humanitarian outlook among workers. The unions presented a barrier to the Nazi effort to control all areas of life and create a corporate fascist state. Therefore, the Nazis made a priority of eliminating trade unions in Germany. In their place, Hitler set up the German Labor Front, which included both employers and workers, under the guise of providing benefits and services to workers. It supported the racist and pro-corporate Nazi agenda and spread Nazi propaganda among workers. Jews were banned from membership, collective bargaining and the right to strike were outlawed, pay and working conditions were decided by Hitler's officials. As a result, wages were frozen, and the average work week increased by 20% in just a few years. Hitler's destruction of unions was supported by important German business leaders and conservative politicians who shared the Nazi fear of a socialist revolution during the turbulent 1920s and early 1930s. Many of those people wanted restrictions on or complete abolition of unions, which they felt had become too powerful. This was one reason why many conservatives helped the Nazis come into power and joined or supported Hitler's government. Between 1933 and 1945, thousands of German trade unionists were arrested and imprisoned, and many were tortured, executed, or sent to concentration camps. Next up on the chopping block, we have the economy of Nazi Germany. Let's read this. The German economy, like those of many other Western nations, suffered the effects of the Great Depression, with unemployment soaring around the Wall Street crash of 1929. When Adolf Hitler became Chancellor of Germany in 1933, he introduced policies aimed at improving the economy. The changes included privatization of state industries, autarky, which is also known as national economic self-sufficiency, and tariffs on imports. The Nazi government developed a partnership with leading German business interests, who supported the goals of the regime and its war effort in exchange for advantageous contracts and subsidies, as well as the suppression of the trade union movement. The latter was also done because the Nazi Party saw trade unions as exercising more power over the workers than it could. Cartels and monopolies were encouraged at the expense of small businesses, even though the Nazis had received considerable electoral support from small business owners. Nazi Germany maintained a supply of slave labor composed of prisoners and concentration camp inmates, which was greatly expanded after the beginning of World War II. In Poland alone, some 5 million citizens, including Polish Jews, were used as slave labor throughout the war. Among the slave laborers in the occupied territories, hundreds of thousands were used by leading German corporations, including Thyssen, Krupp, IG Farben, Bosch, Junkers, Volkswagen, as well as Dutch corporation Philips. By 1944, slave labor made up 1/4 of Germany's entire workforce, and the majority of German factories had a contingent of prisoners. Privatization and business ties. The Great Depression had spurred increased state ownership in most Western capitalist countries. This also took place in Germany during the last years of the Weimar Republic, but after the Nazis took power, industries were privatized en masse. Several banks, shipyards, railway lines, shipping lines, welfare organizations, and more were privatized. One of the reasons for the Nazi privatization policy was to cement the partnership between the government and business interests. Another reason was financial. As the Nazi government faced budget deficits due to its military spending, privatization was one of the methods it used to raise more funds. Between the fiscal years of 1934 through 1935 and 1937 through 1938, privatization represented 1.4% of the German government's revenues. There was also an ideological motivation. Nazi ideology held entrepreneurship in high regard, and private property was considered a precondition to developing the creativity of members of the German race in the best interest of the people. The Nazi leadership believed that private property itself provided important incentives to achieve greater cost consciousness, efficiency gains, and technical progress. Adolf Hitler used social Darwinist arguments to support this stance, cautioning against the bureaucratic managing of the economy that would preserve the weak and represent a burden to the higher ability, industry, and value. The month after being appointed chancellor, Hitler made a personal appeal to German business leaders to help fund the Nazi Party for the crucial months that were to follow. He argued that they should support him in establishing a dictatorship because private enterprise cannot be maintained in the age of democracy, and because democracy would allegedly lead to communism. In the following weeks, the Nazi Party received contributions from 17 different business groups, with the largest coming from IG Farben and Deutsche Bank. Many of these businesses continued to support Hitler even during the war and even profited from the persecution of the Jews, the most infamous being firms like Krupp and IG Farben, and some large automobile manufacturers. Historian Adam Tooze writes that the leaders of German business were therefore willing partners in the destruction of political pluralism in Germany. In exchange, owners and managers of German businesses were granted unprecedented powers to control their workforce, collective bargaining was abolished, and wages were frozen at a relatively low level. Business profits also rose very rapidly, as did corporate investment. So, can I ask you guys a serious question? Does this sound like a socialist country to you? I mean, they literally implemented mass privatization, they aligned themselves with massive private industries, they destroyed trade unions and crushed worker strikes, they killed off the anti-capitalist wing of their party. But of course, to people like Razor Fist, socialism is when government does stuff, and like I think Nazi Germany had like price controls during their wartime economy, some like really dumb shit like that.